In a quiet neighborhood, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the streets. People were winding down their day, and children played on sidewalks. But one man, Officer Derek Stone, patrolled the area with a frown on his face. He was a racist cop, and his mind was clouded with prejudice. He saw the world through a narrow lens, judging others based on their appearance. As Officer Stone drove through the neighborhood in his police cruiser, he looked for trouble. He wanted to catch someone doing something wrong. He thought this was his duty, but it was really just a way for him to exercise his bias. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, and his expression grew darker as he noticed a group of teenagers laughing and having fun. He slowed down, eyeing them suspiciously, but they were just enjoying their evening. Then his gaze fell upon an elderly black woman sitting quietly on a bench. Her name was Mrs. Johnson. She wore a simple dress and a warm smile as she watched the children play. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and was known for her kindness and wisdom. But to Officer Stone, she was just another target, someone he could pick on to feel powerful. Without thinking, he parked his cruiser and stepped out, his uniform crisp and imposing. The sound of his heavy boots on the pavement echoed in the quiet evening air. He approached Mrs. Johnson with an air of arrogance, the kind that only comes from a person who feels superior. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply, crossing his arms over his chest. His tone was harsh, full of suspicion. He had no reason to question her, but that didn't matter to him. To him, she was an outsider in her own neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson looked up, surprised by his sudden aggression. "I'm just enjoying the evening, officer," she replied gently. Her voice was calm, filled with warmth. She was not afraid, but she could see the hostility in his eyes. "Enjoying the evening, huh?" he scoffed, stepping closer. "You think you can just sit here and do nothing? You don't belong here." His words dripped with disdain, each one meant to intimidate. Mrs. Johnson felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she held it back. She had dealt with prejudice all her life and knew how to handle it. "I live right over there," she said, pointing to her small house just a few yards away. "I have lived here for over 30 years. This is my home." But Officer Stone wasn't interested in her words. His mind was made up. "Your kind don't belong in this neighborhood," he said coldly, dismissing her completely. "You should be careful. People like you don't get to relax here." The injustice of his words struck Mrs. Johnson deeply. She had always fought against racism and had worked hard to build a community filled with love and support. How could this man think she was a threat? She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "Officer, I'm just an old woman trying to enjoy the sunset," she said softly. "I have lived here peacefully. You don't have to be so hostile." But the cop wasn't listening. He stepped even closer, his face now just inches from hers. "I don't care who you are. You're just trouble waiting to happen," he barked, his voice rising. The tension in the air was palpable, and people nearby began to notice the commotion. A few pedestrians stopped to watch, concerned about what was happening. They could see the fear in Mrs. Johnson's eyes, but they also saw her strength. She was not a woman to be bullied easily. "What's going on here?" one young man called out, stepping closer. Officer Stone turned, momentarily distracted. "Mind your own business," he shouted, but his voice was shaky. He felt the eyes of the community on him, but the anger inside him burned too fiercely to back down now. He felt threatened by the presence of witnesses and knew he had to show he was in control. Returning his focus to Mrs. Johnson, he suddenly pushed her. She stumbled back, her hands flying up to protect herself. Gasps erupted from the small crowd that had gathered. Mrs. Johnson steadied herself, shock and anger mixing in her heart. "Why are you doing this?" she exclaimed, her voice rising now, emboldened by the attention of the onlookers. "I have done nothing wrong." Officer Stone glared at her, his face a mask of hatred. "I can do whatever I want. You should know your place," he shouted, his temper flaring. But as Mrs. Johnson stood there, defiant and proud, she felt a wave of support from the crowd. She knew that this encounter was about more than just her. It was about standing up against injustice. She was not just an elderly woman on a bench. She was a pillar of the community, and she would not be silenced by a racist cop. The scene was set, and the night was about to take a dramatic turn. Little did Officer Stone know that his actions would spark a movement, igniting the strength and courage of those who had suffered silently for far too long. The battle between prejudice and justice was just beginning. The evening air grew thick with tension as the small crowd watched the confrontation unfold. Officer Derek Stone, consumed by anger and arrogance, stood facing Mrs. Johnson, his posture aggressive and threatening. But she stood firm, her heart racing yet resolute. She was not going to let this man intimidate her or belittle her existence in her own neighborhood. "Do you think you can just sit here and do nothing?" Officer Stone barked, his voice echoing in the stillness. "You have no right to be here. This is not a place for you." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating and heavy. Mrs. Johnson looked around at the concerned faces in the crowd. She could feel their support, and it fueled her courage. "I have every right to be here, officer," she replied, her voice steady despite the anger boiling within her. "I've lived here longer than you've worn that badge. I'm not causing any trouble. I'm simply enjoying my evening." But Officer Stone didn't want to hear her truth. He was too wrapped up in his prejudice to listen to reason. "I've had enough of your kind," he said, spitting the words out with venom. "You're all the same. You think you can come here and do what you want, but I won't allow it." As he spoke, the crowd began to murmur, whispering amongst themselves. People were shocked by his blatant racism and hostility. Some even pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation, ready to capture the injustice unfolding before them. "Hey, you can't treat her like that," shouted a young woman from the crowd, her voice ringing clear. She stepped forward, her phone held high, capturing the moment. "She's just an old lady enjoying her life. You have no right to bully her." Officer Stone turned his attention to the woman, his eyes narrowing with irritation. "And who are you?" "Another troublemaker," he snapped. He didn't like being challenged, especially in front of witnesses. Mrs. Johnson felt a rush of gratitude for the young woman's support. She could feel the strength of the community behind her, and it gave her the resolve to stand her ground. "This is my home, officer," she said again, her voice rising above the noise. "I've lived here for decades. You are the one causing trouble." "Enough of this," Officer Stone shouted, stepping even closer to Mrs. Johnson, his fists clenching. "You don't get to speak to me like that. I'm the law here." In that moment, he raised his hand, ready to push her again, but the crowd erupted into chaos. "Stop! Don't touch her," shouted a man, stepping forward to shield Mrs. Johnson. "You're supposed to protect us, not attack us." The tension in the air crackled like electricity. People in the crowd began to shout, voicing their anger at Officer Stone's actions. "You're not above the law," someone yelled. "You're just a bully in a uniform." Feeling cornered, Officer Stone's face flushed with rage. The power he had relied on began to slip away as more people gathered, their phones recording everything. He was supposed to be the authority, the one in control, but now he felt like a villain in a story he never intended to tell. Mrs. Johnson stood taller, the support from the crowd giving her strength. "I will not be afraid of you," she declared, her voice strong and unwavering. "You may wear a badge, but that doesn't give you the right to harm innocent people." As the crowd chanted her words, Officer Stone's bravado wavered. He looked around, seeing the disapproving faces of the community. He had expected to intimidate, to assert his power, but instead, he had sparked a fire. The people were standing up for Mrs. Johnson, and he was losing control. "Back off," Officer Stone shouted, attempting to regain his authority. But the people were done backing down. They formed a protective barrier around Mrs. Johnson, their faces determined and angry. "Leave her alone," shouted another voice from the back of the crowd. "You'll regret this." Officer Stone felt trapped. He knew he couldn't continue this confrontation without making himself look worse in front of everyone. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. "Fine. Just remember this," he sneered, stepping back but still glaring at Mrs. Johnson. "You're lucky this time, but don't think I won't be watching you." With that, he turned and stormed back to his cruiser, his face red with anger. The crowd began to disperse, but they were not finished. They had witnessed something terrible, and they wouldn't let it go. Mrs. Johnson's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. She turned to the people who had come to her aid, tears of appreciation in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't think anyone would stand up for me." The young woman who had first spoken stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Mrs. Johnson's shoulder. "You're not alone, ma'am. We will fight for you. This isn't over." And in that moment, Mrs. Johnson knew that the fight against racism and injustice was just beginning. The community was stronger together, and they would not back down. The night was dark, but their spirits were bright, igniting a spark of hope in the face of adversity. Little did they know that this confrontation would lead to a much larger battle for justice and equality in their community. In the days that followed the confrontation, the story of Mrs. Johnson and Officer Derek Stone spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. News of the incident reached local media outlets, igniting discussions about racism and police misconduct. Videos of the encounter circulated online, showing the world what had happened that evening. Many people were outraged, while others defended Officer Stone, claiming he was just doing his job. Mrs. Johnson found herself at the center of a growing movement. People began to rally around her, organizing peaceful protests to demand accountability for Officer Stone's actions. They made signs that read, "Justice for Mrs. Johnson," and "No place for racism in our community." What began as a simple act of kindness turned into a powerful demonstration of unity and strength. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch, Mrs. Johnson watched as a group of her neighbors gathered across the street. They were discussing plans for the upcoming protest. She felt a mix of pride and apprehension. She had always been a quiet advocate for equality, but now she was becoming a symbol of the fight against racism. "I can't believe this is happening," she said to herself, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and concern. "I just wanted to enjoy a peaceful evening." As the protest date approached, local news stations began covering the event, interviewing residents about their experiences with racism and police brutality. People shared their stories of injustice, some of which echoed Mrs. Johnson's own experiences. The community was coming together in a way she had never seen before, and it filled her with hope. On the day of the protest, the sun shone brightly, illuminating the faces of the gathered crowd. They stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their cause. Mrs. Johnson was there, holding a sign that read, "Racism has no place here." She felt a sense of empowerment as she joined her neighbors, standing tall against the injustices that had plagued their community for too long. As the march began, chants of "Justice for Mrs. Johnson" echoed through the streets. They marched past schools, shops, and homes, drawing the attention of everyone in the area. Some joined the march, adding their voices to the growing chorus for change. Others watched from their windows, some in support, while others looked on with indifference. Among the crowd was Officer Stone, who had returned to patrol the neighborhood, now feeling the weight of scrutiny on his shoulders. He drove slowly, his expression hardening as he spotted the protesters. It was clear they were not going to back down. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, frustration boiling within him. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "They don't understand the law. They're just making it worse." He felt the anger rise in him as he remembered how Mrs. Johnson had stood up to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. As he observed the crowd, Officer Stone's resolve hardened. He made a decision to confront them again. He couldn't let them think they could challenge him without consequences. He parked his cruiser at the end of the street and stepped out, his uniform crisp and intimidating. The protesters noticed him immediately. The chants grew louder, and some people pointed in his direction, their anger palpable. Mrs. Johnson spotted him and felt a rush of adrenaline. She knew this was not going to end well. "Stay calm, everyone," she called out, her voice steady. "Let's keep this peaceful." But Officer Stone strode forward, his eyes locked on her. "You think you can just march around here and disrespect the law?" he shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing but a bunch of troublemakers." The crowd erupted in anger, shouting back at him, but Mrs. Johnson stepped forward. "We are not troublemakers, officer. We are standing up for what is right. You can't silence us with your threats." Stone sneered at her, trying to project authority. "You're going to regret this. I'm not going to let you think you can defy me." The tension escalated, and the crowd grew more agitated. People shouted, urging Stone to leave. They felt empowered by their unity and were not afraid of his intimidation tactics. "I'm here to uphold the law," Stone barked, but his voice wavered slightly. He could sense that the crowd was not backing down. They were unified in their cause, and he was isolated in his anger. "Upholding the law," shouted a young man from the crowd. "You mean bullying innocent people. You need to be held accountable for your actions." At that moment, a local news crew arrived, cameras rolling. The sight of the protesters and Officer Stone facing off became a focal point for the evening news. Mrs. Johnson stood tall, and the people rallied behind her, their voices growing stronger. Officer Stone could feel the pressure mounting. He glanced at the cameras, realizing he was under scrutiny. The last thing he wanted was to look weak in front of the public. But the truth was, he was losing control of the narrative. "This isn't over," he shouted, retreating to his cruiser, but the crowd remained strong. They cheered for Mrs. Johnson, chanting her name as they turned to continue their march. That day marked a turning point in the community. The fight against racism and injustice had sparked a movement that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Johnson felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that together they were making a difference. They were not just fighting for her. They were fighting for every person who had ever felt marginalized or oppressed. The power of the community was undeniable, and Mrs. Johnson understood that the struggle was just beginning. She had ignited a flame of resistance, and as long as they stood together, they could face any storm that came their way. The protests continued for weeks, growing larger and more organized. Each gathering drew in more supporters, transforming from a local movement into a regional cause. Mrs. Johnson, now a respected figure in the fight for justice, became a beacon of hope for many. Her story inspired countless people to join in, each bringing their own experiences of prejudice and injustice. However, not everyone was pleased with the movement. Officer Derek Stone, feeling the pressure mounting against him, became increasingly agitated. He began to lash out at anyone who challenged him, reinforcing his negative reputation among the community. The whispers about his behavior reached the ears of his superiors, who were now under scrutiny themselves. One evening, after a long day of protests, Mrs. Johnson sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she reflected on how far they had come. The community was united, but she knew there was still a long road ahead. She also felt the weight of her new role. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a leader. As she pondered these thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was a text from one of the protest organizers, Kelly. "We need to meet. Things are getting serious with Officer Stone. Can you come to the community center?" Mrs. Johnson quickly gathered her things and made her way to the center, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. Upon arriving, she found a group of passionate individuals already gathered, their expressions serious. "Thank you for coming, everyone," Kelly began, her voice steady. "We've received reports that Officer Stone is planning to escalate his actions against us. He's been spreading rumors and threatening people who speak out." A murmur of concern rippled through the group. Mrs. Johnson's heart sank. "What can we do to protect ourselves?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. "We need to document everything," Kelly replied. "If he threatens anyone, we have to have evidence. We're also considering reaching out to local media to keep the pressure on him. If we can expose his behavior, it might deter him from acting out." Mrs. Johnson nodded, feeling the urgency of the situation. "We can't let fear silence us. We need to stand together, no matter what." As the discussion continued, they outlined a plan to mobilize their supporters and maintain a strong presence at upcoming protests. They would not let Officer Stone intimidate them. Instead, they would confront him with the strength of their unity. The next day, the protests resumed, and the crowd was larger than ever. Signs filled the air, proclaiming messages of justice and equality. Mrs. Johnson felt a swell of pride as she took her place at the front of the march, surrounded by friends and allies. But as they marched through the neighborhood, Officer Stone was there, waiting. He stood by his cruiser, arms crossed and a scowl on his face. The moment he saw the crowd approaching, his anger flared. He stepped forward, determined to assert his authority. "Move along," he shouted, trying to intimidate the protesters. "This is a public road, and I'm not going to let you block traffic." But the crowd stood firm. "We have the right to protest," shouted a young man in the front row. "You can't silence us." Officer Stone's face turned red with rage. "You think you can just ignore the law? You're making a big mistake." His voice was laced with threats, but the crowd was undeterred. They continued to chant for justice, their resolve only growing stronger in the face of his hostility. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, feeling the weight of the crowd behind her. "We're not afraid of you, officer," she declared, her voice ringing clear. "You work for us, and we demand respect." Officer Stone sneered, but deep down, he felt the pressure mounting. The eyes of the community were on him, and the cameras were rolling again. This wasn't just another confrontation. This was a pivotal moment. "Back off, or I'll arrest you all for disorderly conduct," he threatened, trying to regain some semblance of control. But the crowd erupted in laughter, knowing that his threats were empty. "You can't arrest us for standing up for our rights," a woman shouted back. "You're the one who needs to answer for your actions." The situation escalated, and Officer Stone found himself surrounded by the protesters. His bravado crumbled as he realized he was isolated, with nowhere to turn. The crowd continued to chant, their voices echoing through the streets. "Justice for Mrs. Johnson. Justice for all." Seeing the determination in their eyes, Officer Stone took a step back, a mix of anger and fear flashing across his face. He knew he was losing control, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. Maybe the community wouldn't let him bully them anymore. "I won't forget this," he shouted as he retreated to his cruiser, slamming the door shut. The protesters cheered, their voices rising triumphantly. That evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of victory. They had stood up against Officer Stone and his threats, proving that their voices mattered. But she also knew that this battle was just the beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but together, they were stronger. As she left the protest, surrounded by her supportive friends and neighbors, she felt hope blossom within her. They were fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever faced discrimination. The community was awakening, and Mrs. Johnson knew that they would continue to rise, united against injustice, no matter the cost. As the protests continued, the community's resolve only grew stronger. Each event attracted more supporters, and the message of unity against injustice spread like wildfire. Mrs. Johnson, now a figurehead for the movement, was frequently interviewed by local news outlets, sharing her story and the importance of standing up against racism. However, the tension between the protesters and Officer Derek Stone escalated. He became increasingly desperate to assert his authority. Feeling cornered as the community rallied around Mrs. Johnson, he started to patrol the area more aggressively, determined to intimidate the protesters and regain control. One afternoon, Mrs. Johnson received a call from Kelly. "We need to meet with the local news stations again. We're planning a bigger protest next week, and I want to make sure we're prepared." "Absolutely," Mrs. Johnson replied, her heart racing with excitement. "What do you have in mind?" "We want to draw even more attention to the issue. We're thinking of organizing a march for justice that will culminate in front of the police station. This will send a clear message to Officer Stone and the department that we won't back down." Mrs. Johnson felt a surge of determination. "Let's do it. We need to show them that we're not just a passing moment. We're a movement." As the week progressed, excitement filled the air. Flyers were distributed, social media buzzed with anticipation, and the community came together to prepare for the march. The message was clear. They were fighting for justice, equality, and accountability. On the day of the March for Justice, the sun rose bright, casting a warm glow over the streets. Mrs. Johnson arrived early, her heart swelling with pride as she watched the crowd gather. Friends, family, and supporters from all walks of life filled the area, each person holding a sign and chanting slogans of hope. As the march began, the energy was electric. They moved through the neighborhood, chanting, "No justice, no peace." The voices grew louder as they neared the police station, and Mrs. Johnson could feel the power of their unity in the air. But as they approached the station, Officer Stone was waiting. His cruiser was parked nearby, and he stood outside, arms crossed, his expression tense. The sight of him only fueled the crowd's determination. "Look, it's Officer Stone," someone shouted. "Let's show him what we stand for." The protesters surged forward, their chants echoing off the walls of the police station. "Justice for Mrs. Johnson. Justice for all." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, feeling the weight of her role. She raised her sign high and shouted, "We are here to demand justice. We will not be intimidated." Stone's gaze hardened as he stepped closer, his presence casting a shadow over the crowd. "You think this will change anything? You're making a fool of yourselves," he shouted, trying to provoke them. But the crowd stood firm, refusing to back down. "You're the fool for thinking we'll be silent," a young woman yelled back. Feeling the pressure mount, Stone made a hasty decision. "You're all trespassing. If you don't disperse, I will have to make arrests." Laughter erupted from the crowd, their unity amplifying their courage. "Arrest us for standing up for justice." "Go ahead," someone shouted. "You'll just make us stronger." At that moment, Mrs. Johnson raised her voice above the crowd. "We're not here to cause trouble, officer. We're here to stand up for what's right. Your threats won't silence us." Stone hesitated, feeling the weight of the crowd's determination. He knew he was losing control, and the cameras were rolling. The world was watching, and his actions would be scrutinized. Suddenly, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Officer Stone, can you comment on the protesters' demands for accountability and justice?" Caught off guard, he glanced around, realizing that this was not just about him anymore. The narrative was shifting, and he was at the center of it. "This is a public safety issue," he snapped, trying to regain his authority. "I'm here to maintain order." "Order?" the reporter pressed. "Or oppression? The community is calling for transparency and justice. How do you respond to that?" Feeling cornered, Stone struggled for a reply. "I'm just doing my job. You don't understand the dangers we face every day." Mrs. Johnson seized the moment. "We understand the dangers, officer, but we also understand that fear cannot justify racism or abuse of power. We demand respect." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a united force against his intimidation. Stone felt the heat of their anger, but also the power of their unity. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Maybe this wasn't about him. Maybe this was about something much bigger. As the march continued, the atmosphere shifted. Officer Stone stood there, confronted not just by the protesters, but by the realization that he could no longer operate in a bubble of authority. The community was awake, and they were not going to back down. As the protesters finally reached the steps of the police station, Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, feeling a sense of purpose wash over her. They had made their voices heard, and together, they were standing strong. This was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The struggle for justice had ignited a fire within the community, and they were determined to keep that flame alive. Mrs. Johnson knew this was just the beginning, but with every step they took, they were forging a path toward a better future, one where they could no longer be silenced. The aftermath of the March for Justice reverberated throughout the community. News outlets covered the event extensively, highlighting the growing movement against racism and police brutality. Mrs. Johnson became a symbol of hope, inspiring many to share their own stories of discrimination and resilience. With every interview and public appearance, her voice grew stronger. The community rallied behind her, organizing more protests and discussions about police accountability. They knew that their collective power could bring about change, and they were determined to push forward. However, not everyone was supportive of the movement. Officer Derek Stone, feeling increasingly isolated, turned to his fellow officers for backup. He began to spread lies about the protesters, claiming they were violent and dangerous. But the more he tried to undermine their efforts, the more the community banded together. One evening, while attending a meeting at the community center, Mrs. Johnson noticed a tension in the air. As people gathered to discuss the next steps, whispers filled the room. Many were concerned about Stone's threats and the potential for retaliation. "We can't let fear control us," Mrs. Johnson stated, standing up. "We've come too far to back down now. Our voices matter, and we need to keep fighting for what's right." The room erupted in applause, and the energy shifted back to determination. They discussed plans for a town hall meeting, inviting local leaders, activists, and even police officials to address the community's concerns. This would be an opportunity to voice their demands for change directly to those in power. As the day of the town hall approached, Mrs. Johnson felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. She knew the stakes were high, but she also believed in the strength of their unity. On the evening of the meeting, the community center was packed. People filled every seat, eager to participate in this pivotal moment. As the meeting began, Mrs. Johnson took her place at the front, ready to speak. Local officials and representatives from the police department were present, including Officer Stone, who sat in the back, his expression unreadable. The mayor opened the meeting, acknowledging the growing concerns about police-community relations. "We are here to listen and to work together toward a solution," he said, attempting to set a cooperative tone. But as community members began to voice their experiences, the atmosphere shifted. One by one, they shared stories of discrimination, fear, and the need for accountability. The room filled with emotion as people recounted moments when they had felt powerless, faced with the weight of systemic injustice. Then it was Mrs. Johnson's turn to speak. She stood tall, her heart pounding. "We are not here to create division. We are here to seek justice," she began, her voice steady. "Officer Stone's actions have hurt our community, and we need to address the toxic culture within the police department that allows this behavior to continue." Gasps echoed throughout the room. Mrs. Johnson pressed on, her words fueled by the support of her fellow community members. "This is not just about one officer. It's about a system that has allowed racism and abuse of power to thrive. We need real change, and we need it now." Stone's face flushed with anger, but he remained silent. The community was rallying around Mrs. Johnson, and he could feel the tide turning against him. As the meeting progressed, the crowd grew more passionate, calling for reforms, increased training for officers, and transparent policies to hold law enforcement accountable. The demands were clear, and the voices united in purpose were impossible to ignore. Suddenly, an unexpected voice rang out from the back of the room. It was a young officer, speaking up for the first time. "I'm a police officer, and I don't agree with what Officer Stone has done," he admitted, his voice shaking. "We're supposed to protect and serve our community, not intimidate it. We need to listen to what you're saying." A hush fell over the crowd, and then applause erupted. Mrs. Johnson felt a surge of hope. Change was possible, and even those within the police force recognized the need for reform. As the meeting drew to a close, the mayor promised to take their concerns seriously and work toward a plan for change. The community left feeling empowered, but Mrs. Johnson knew the fight was far from over. Officer Stone still posed a threat, and they needed to remain vigilant. In the days that followed, news of the town hall meeting spread, sparking discussions throughout the city. The movement gained momentum, and more people began to stand up against injustice. Mrs. Johnson continued to share her story, empowering others to do the same. But Officer Stone was not ready to back down. He began to retaliate against the protesters, using his position to intimidate those who spoke out. His actions only served to galvanize the community further, igniting a fire within them that refused to be extinguished. One evening, Mrs. Johnson received a call from Kelly, who was in a panic. "We need to talk. Stone is targeting some of our members. He's threatening to arrest anyone who participates in the protests." Mrs. Johnson felt a surge of anger, but also a sense of determination. "We won't be silenced," she replied firmly. "We need to gather everyone and strategize. We have to protect each other." They quickly organized a meeting, inviting all supporters to discuss how to stand against Stone's intimidation tactics. As the community gathered, Mrs. Johnson felt the strength of their unity surrounding her. They were determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their fight for justice. With every passing day, Mrs. Johnson realized that their struggle was more than just about her. It was about all those who had been silenced for too long. They were not just fighting for justice, they were building a movement that would echo through generations, challenging the status quo and demanding a future where everyone could feel safe and respected. As they prepared for the next round of protests and continued their fight for accountability, Mrs. Johnson knew they were on the brink of something monumental. Their unity had the power to change hearts and minds, and together they would rise above the challenges that lay ahead. The movement reached a boiling point as the community prepared for one of their largest protests yet. With support pouring in from surrounding neighborhoods and local organizations, they were ready to make their voices heard on a grand scale. Mrs. Johnson felt the excitement in the air, but a sense of dread also loomed over her. Officer Derek Stone had become increasingly aggressive, and she knew he wouldn't let this protest go unchallenged. As the day approached, the community gathered for a final meeting to discuss the logistics of the protest. Kelly stood up, addressing the crowd with a serious tone. "We need to be prepared for anything. Stone has shown he's willing to intimidate and bully us, but we cannot back down. Our message is clear. We demand justice." The crowd erupted in applause, their spirits high. Mrs. Johnson spoke up, her voice steady and resolute. "This is about more than just us. It's about everyone who has been silenced and oppressed. We have the power to create change, and we must stand together, no matter what." On the day of the protest, the sun shone brightly as community members gathered, carrying signs that proclaimed messages of hope, justice, and unity. They marched through the streets, chanting slogans that echoed off the buildings. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a shared sense of purpose. As they approached the police station, Mrs. Johnson felt her heart race. She could see Officer Stone standing outside, flanked by a group of officers. The tension in the air was palpable, but she refused to let fear take hold. They had come too far to turn back now. "Stay strong," she shouted to the crowd, raising her sign high. "We are here to stand for justice." As the protesters arrived at the police station, they lined up in front of the building, their signs held high. Officer Stone stepped forward, his expression stern. "You need to disperse. This is an unlawful assembly," he barked, trying to assert his authority. But the crowd stood their ground, unyielding in their resolve. "No justice, no peace," they chanted, their voices united in defiance. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her heart pounding but her spirit unwavering. "We are not here to cause trouble. We are here to demand change." "Enough," Stone shouted, frustration etched on his face. "You're all breaking the law. I won't warn you again." Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, knowing this was a pivotal moment. "We are demanding accountability, Officer Stone. You can't silence us anymore." Just then, a loud voice rang out from the crowd. "Officer Stone, you represent a broken system. We are here to fix it." It was the young officer who had spoken at the town hall meeting. He stepped forward, a determined look in his eyes. "We need to support our community, not intimidate it." Stone's face twisted in disbelief, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The young officer continued, "We have to stand together against racism and injustice. This is about all of us." The protesters erupted in cheers, feeling a renewed sense of hope. Mrs. Johnson could hardly believe what she was witnessing. For the first time, a police officer was standing with them instead of against them. Stone, realizing he was losing control, barked orders to his officers. "Arrest anyone who refuses to disperse." But the young officer raised his hand, stepping in front of his fellow officers. "Not today. We're not arresting anyone here. This is our community, and we're here to protect it." A heated argument broke out among the officers, dividing them between those who stood with Stone and those who supported the protesters. Mrs. Johnson seized the opportunity, raising her voice once more. "We are all human beings. We deserve to be treated with respect and dignity." The crowd responded with a thunderous cheer, their spirits soaring as they felt the shift in momentum. The division among the police officers was becoming increasingly evident, and the power of their unity was palpable. Feeling cornered, Officer Stone took a step back, his face flushing with rage. "This is not over. You will regret this," he shouted, but his voice lacked the authority it once had. The crowd was no longer afraid of him. The young officer turned to the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "We need to make it clear that we stand for justice, not oppression. Together, we can create a better future for our community." As the crowd rallied behind him, Mrs. Johnson felt an overwhelming sense of pride. They had come together in the face of adversity, and their collective strength had begun to reshape the narrative. This was not just about one protest. This was a movement that could change the fabric of their community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the scene, Mrs. Johnson realized this was just the beginning. They had opened the door to dialogue and change, and the community was ready to continue pushing forward. With renewed energy, the crowd began to chant, "Justice for all! Justice for all!" Their voices echoed through the streets, a powerful testament to their resilience and determination. As the protest continued, Mrs. Johnson looked around, seeing the faces of her neighbors, friends, and allies. They had faced their fears and stood strong together. No longer would they be silenced by intimidation or hatred. They had ignited a fire within their community that would not be extinguished. This was not just a moment, it was a movement built on love, respect, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves justice. And together, they would continue to fight for that justice, inspiring future generations to stand up for what is right. In the days that followed, discussions about police reform and community engagement became central to the local agenda. Mrs. Johnson and the young officer worked together to bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement, paving the way for a safer, more inclusive future. As she reflected on the journey they had taken, Mrs. Johnson knew that every step they had taken mattered. They had transformed fear into strength, anger into hope, and division into unity. Together, they were not just changing their community, they were changing the world. In the weeks following the protest, a palpable change swept through the community. News of their united stand against Officer Derek Stone and the call for justice reverberated beyond their neighborhood, igniting similar movements in other cities. Mrs. Johnson became a beacon of hope, her story featured in articles, podcasts, and interviews across various platforms. The community's determination to seek justice sparked conversations at local government meetings. Officials could no longer ignore the demands for reform. Mrs. Johnson, alongside the young officer, became a key voice advocating for change. They organized. As the season changed and autumn approached, they prepared for a major community event, a Unity Day celebration to honor their achievements and showcase their resilience. It was a day to celebrate diversity, foster connections, and promote understanding between law enforcement and the community. On the day of the event, the park was filled with laughter, music, and vibrant colors. Families gathered, sharing food and stories, while local artists displayed their work. Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of pride as she watched people come together, breaking down barriers and building relationships. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Johnson took the stage to address the crowd. "Today, we celebrate our strength as a community," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Together, we have faced challenges, and together, we will continue to fight for justice. Our unity is our power." The crowd erupted in applause, and as she looked out at the sea of faces, she knew they had created something meaningful. They were no longer just individuals fighting against injustice. They were a community bound together by a shared vision for a better future. In the weeks that followed, the momentum from Unity Day carried them forward. Discussions about police reform gained traction, and community members began to see tangible changes in their relationship with law enforcement. They held regular meetings with police officials, fostering understanding and cooperation. However, Stone remained a thorn in their side. He continued to spread negativity and resistance, but the community was resilient. They were determined to keep pushing for change, and they refused to let his hostility derail their progress. As winter approached, Mrs. Johnson reflected on their journey. They had transformed fear into courage, division into unity, and despair into hope. They had ignited a movement that would resonate far beyond their neighborhood, challenging others to stand up against injustice. With every step they took, they were shaping a future where justice prevailed, and everyone could live without fear of oppression. Together, they had created a foundation for lasting change, and Mrs. Johnson knew that their fight for justice was just beginning. As the year came to a close, she looked forward with hope, knowing that their journey was far from over. The path ahead would be challenging, but she had faith in her community. They had come together in the face of adversity, and together, they would continue to rise for what was right. As winter settled over the community, the fight for justice continued, but shadows lingered from their earlier struggles. Despite the progress they had made, the past weighed heavily on many residents, especially those directly affected by Officer Stone's actions. The memories of fear and intimidation had not faded. They remained fresh in the minds of those who had faced injustice. Mrs. Johnson knew that healing would take time. She organized support groups for those affected by Stone's hostility, providing a safe space for them to share their experiences and process their feelings. The meetings took place in the warmth of the community center, where candles flickered and the air was filled with the comforting scent of herbal tea. During one of the sessions, Mrs. Johnson noticed a young man named Malik sitting quietly in the corner. He had been deeply affected by the events surrounding the protest. In his late 20s, Malik had grown up in the neighborhood and had witnessed firsthand the changes that had taken place over the years. However, the recent conflict with the police left him feeling disillusioned and angry. "Malik, would you like to share something?" Mrs. Johnson asked gently, sensing his struggle. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. Taking a deep breath, Malik began, "I used to think that change was possible. But after everything that happened, I feel lost. It's like I'm fighting a battle that can't be won." Mrs. Johnson nodded empathetically. "I understand how you feel. It's easy to lose hope when faced with such challenges. But remember, we've made progress together, and we can keep moving forward." Malik looked around at the faces of those who had come to support one another. "I just don't know if it's enough," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "What if Officer Stone never changes? What if he continues to hurt our community? Change takes time, Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice steady. It's not just about one officer. It's about transforming the system. And that starts with us. We can't give up. We owe it to ourselves and to future generations to keep pushing for a better world. The group began to discuss their fears and hopes, finding solace in each other's stories. Slowly, Malik opened up more, sharing how he had witnessed the impact of racism on his family and friends. The support from others helped him realize that he was not alone in his feelings. As spring blossomed in the community, a sense of renewed hope and energy filled the air. The town hall meeting had sparked a fire, pushing residents to unite against the lingering shadows of racism and injustice. The community's resolve strengthened with each gathering and event, but the specter of Officer Stone loomed larger than ever. Mrs. Johnson and her allies organized a Spring of Change festival to celebrate their progress and foster community spirit. They invited local artists, musicians, and activists to share their talents and stories, creating a vibrant atmosphere filled with laughter and joy. The festival was a chance for everyone to come together, share their dreams for the future, and remind one another of their collective strength. However, as the planning progressed, whispers of resistance began to circulate within the police department. Officer Stone, feeling increasingly threatened by the community's growing solidarity, decided to take drastic measures. He sought to undermine the festival, convinced that it would only draw attention to the tensions he wanted to suppress. Stone gathered a few like-minded officers and devised a plan to intimidate the organizers. "We'll show them who's really in control," he sneered, determination etched on his face. His tactics were meant to instill fear, but Mrs. Johnson and her team were undeterred. They had faced adversity before, and they knew that unity was their greatest weapon. As the day of the festival approached, the atmosphere was electric. Families set up booths, decorated the park, and prepared for a day filled with music, art, and food. Mrs. Johnson felt a surge of pride as she walked through the park, greeting friends and neighbors who had come together to celebrate their shared vision. However, in the shadows, Officer Stone and his crew began to put their plan into action. They sent officers to patrol the festival, looking for any excuse to disrupt the festivities. Their presence was meant to intimidate, but instead, it fueled the community's determination to stand strong. On the day of the festival, the sun shone brightly, illuminating the park and filling the air with the sounds of laughter and celebration. Mrs. Johnson stood at the front of the stage, looking out at the sea of faces filled with hope and excitement. She could feel the energy of the crowd, their collective spirit igniting a fire within her. As the first band began to play, the atmosphere was electric. People danced, sang, and shared stories, their joy contagious. Mrs. Johnson took a moment to breathe it all in, feeling the warmth of community envelop her. But in the back of her mind, she knew Officer Stone and his crew were lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike. As the afternoon progressed, tension began to rise. Stone and his officers made their presence known, walking through the crowd with an air of authority. They eyed the festival goers, looking for any sign of trouble. Mrs. Johnson noticed their behavior and knew they were there to provoke fear. Determined not to let fear overshadow the day, she took to the stage again. "We are here to celebrate our strength and our unity. No one can take that away from us." Her words resonated with the crowd, sparking cheers and applause. However, Stone's patience wore thin. As the festival continued, he and his officers began to escalate their intimidation tactics. They approached a group of young artists showcasing their work, demanding permits and asking intrusive questions. The artists, feeling the pressure, stood their ground, insisting they had every right to be there. Seeing the confrontation unfold, Mrs. Johnson quickly gathered a group of community members to support the artists. "We have the right to celebrate our culture and our community," she called out, rallying those around her. The crowd began to gather, forming a protective barrier around the artists. Stone felt the tide turning against him. His attempt to instill fear was backfiring, and he realized he needed to regain control. "This is a public event," You need to comply with the law, he barked, trying to assert his authority. But the community stood strong, voices rising in unison. We are not afraid, they shouted back, echoing Mrs. Johnson's sentiment. Their collective strength pushed back against the intimidation, and for a moment, it felt as if the very foundations of fear were crumbling. Stone's face flushed with anger as he realized he was losing this battle. In a fit of rage, he ordered his officers to arrest the artists, but the crowd's energy surged. People stepped forward, arms linked, forming a barrier that no officer could penetrate. Enough is enough, shouted Malik, stepping forward to confront Stone directly. We are not here to break the law. We are here to celebrate our community. You're the ones causing trouble. The crowd roared with approval, their spirits unbroken. Officer Stone, now realizing he was outnumbered, hesitated. His authority was being challenged in a way he had never experienced before. The festival goers' unwavering support for one another sent a powerful message. They would not be silenced or intimidated. Seeing the determination in the crowd, Mrs. Johnson stepped up beside Malik. We are a community that believes in justice and unity. You can't intimidate us into silence, she declared, her voice ringing out with conviction. Stone's eyes darted around, searching for a way to salvage his reputation. He knew he had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. This is your last warning, he shouted, trying to reassert his authority. But the community was resolute. They had faced his intimidation before and had come out stronger. We stand together, they echoed, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. The solidarity among them was unyielding, and they refused to allow Officer Stone to disrupt their celebration. Realizing he was losing control, Stone reluctantly ordered his officers to step back. We'll be watching you, he muttered, but the message had already been sent. The festival continued, the mood lifted by their victory over fear. As the day wore on, the music played louder, the laughter rang out, and the community's spirit soared. They had faced adversity together and emerged victorious, proving that unity and resilience could overcome even the darkest shadows. As night fell and the festival came to a close, Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of pride swell within her. They had shown that they could stand together against intimidation, and their collective strength would continue to drive their fight for justice. But as the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, the reality of Officer Stone's lingering threat loomed overhead. They knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. With renewed determination, they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their quest for a brighter future. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, the Spring of Change Festival came to a vibrant close. Families packed up their booths, and laughter echoed in the air, but the spirit of unity lingered. Mrs. Johnson looked around at her neighbors, feeling proud of their collective strength in the face of Officer Stone's intimidation. However, the taste of victory was bittersweet, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. In the days that followed the festival, the community felt invigorated. Mrs. Johnson organized a follow-up meeting to discuss their next steps. The room was packed, filled with people who were passionate about change and determined to stand up against the racist practices that had plagued their neighborhood for too long. As the meeting commenced, Mrs. Johnson stood at the front, addressing the crowd. We proved at the festival that our voices matter. We showed Officer Stone and his crew that we are not afraid to stand up for our rights. Now, we need to channel this energy into action. Her words ignited a fire within the crowd, and they erupted into applause. Residents began sharing their ideas, eager to find ways to keep the momentum going. Malik suggested organizing regular community events to foster awareness about social issues and racism. Let's keep bringing people together. We can host workshops, invite speakers, and educate ourselves and our neighbors, he proposed. The idea resonated with everyone in the room, and plans started to take shape. They agreed to hold a monthly community conversation, where residents could share their experiences, learn from one another, and worked together to find solutions to the issues they faced. As the weeks went by, the community meetings became a safe haven for residents to express their concerns and aspirations. They shared stories of personal experiences with racism, forming a deep bond among them. The healing and understanding that unfolded in those gatherings were powerful, and many felt a sense of empowerment they hadn't experienced before. However, not everyone was pleased with the community's resurgence. Officer Stone, feeling the pressure of the growing movement, sought ways to reassert his authority. He began to monitor the meetings, lurking in the background, ready to pounce at any sign of dissent. The tension escalated as he spread rumors within the police department, trying to paint the community as troublemakers. One evening, as Mrs. Johnson left a meeting, she noticed Officer Stone waiting outside. His presence was ominous, casting a shadow over the vibrant spirit of the community. "You think you can just stir up trouble and get away with it?" he spat, his tone filled with disdain. Mrs. Johnson stood tall, her heart racing, but she refused to back down. "We're not troublemakers. We're here to seek justice and create change. You should be ashamed of how you treat people in our community," she replied, her voice steady. Stone scoffed, trying to intimidate her. "You're playing a dangerous game, old woman. Just remember who holds the power around here." With that, he turned and walked away. But Mrs. Johnson's resolve only strengthened. In the following weeks, the community continued to gather, and their numbers grew. New faces appeared, drawn by the spirit of change that had taken root. They invited local leaders and activists to speak, fostering a deeper understanding of social justice issues. Each meeting built upon the last, and the community became a powerful force for good. Mrs. Johnson and Malik decided to take their efforts to the next level. They planned a town hall event, inviting local officials, community leaders, and citizens to discuss the importance of racial equality and justice. They wanted to show that the community was united, demanding change not just for themselves but for future generations. As the town hall event approached, excitement buzzed through the neighborhood. Flyers were distributed, and word spread quickly. The community was eager to show that they were not just a collection of individuals, but a united front standing against oppression. On the day of the town hall, the room was filled to capacity. Residents filled every seat, and a palpable energy filled the air. Mrs. Johnson took the stage, her heart swelling with pride as she looked out at the faces of her friends and neighbors. "Today, we stand together as one community. We are here to demand respect, dignity, and equality," she declared, her voice strong and unwavering. As speakers took turns sharing their stories, the audience listened intently, nodding in agreement and sometimes tearing up at the raw emotion on display. The shared experiences created an unbreakable bond among the attendees, reinforcing their commitment to change. But amidst the hope and unity, Officer Stone's dark shadow loomed. He attended the town hall meeting, looking for any opportunity to discredit the community's efforts. As the meeting progressed, he raised his hand, demanding to speak. The crowd tensed, unsure of what he would say. "Let's be clear," Stone started, his tone condescending. "These meetings are just a breeding ground for division. You're not solving any problems. You're just stirring the pot." The audience reacted with gasps and murmurs, their anger bubbling beneath the surface. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, confronting him directly. "This is not about division. This is about healing and moving forward. You represent everything we're fighting against, and we won't let you intimidate us any longer." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in support of Mrs. Johnson. They were no longer afraid of Officer Stone or his threats. The time for change had come, and they were ready to fight for a future free from the shadows of racism. Stone, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, retreated into the background, but the damage was done. The community had stood up to him, and their voices echoed louder than ever before. They were united, empowered, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the town hall meeting concluded, a sense of determination filled the room. They had taken a significant step toward creating change, and Mrs. Johnson knew that their fight was far from over. But together, they were a force to be reckoned with, ready to face the future hand in hand, committed to building a brighter tomorrow. In the weeks that followed the town hall meeting, the community's resolve only grew stronger. The events of that day had ignited a spark within the residents, encouraging them to take a more active role in advocating for justice and equality. They began organizing workshops and inviting local experts to discuss topics such as racial profiling, community safety, and the importance of building trust between law enforcement and residents. Mrs. Johnson took the lead in arranging these sessions, knowing that education was a crucial component of their fight. With her experience and wisdom, she became a beacon of hope for many. Her passion for justice inspired younger generations to participate and learn about their rights and the power of community organizing. One Saturday morning, the community gathered for a workshop at the local community center. The room buzzed with excitement as people settled in, eager to learn. A well-respected civil rights activist, Mr. Thompson, was invited to speak. He had spent decades fighting for justice, and his presence lent credibility to their cause. As Mr. Thompson took the stage, the room fell silent. "Today, we're here to empower each other," he began, his voice resonating with authority. "Knowledge is power, and together, we can dismantle the systems that perpetuate injustice." The crowd nodded in agreement, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He shared powerful stories from his own experiences, recounting the struggles and victories of those who had come before them. "You must understand that change is a journey," he said, looking directly at Mrs. Johnson and the eager faces in the audience. "Every step you take brings you closer to your goals. Do not be discouraged by setbacks. They are part of the process." Inspired by his words, the community engaged in discussions about strategies for effective advocacy. They brainstormed ways to communicate their message, emphasizing the importance of using social media to reach a wider audience. "We can share our stories and experiences to educate others," Malik suggested, his enthusiasm infectious. The residents decided to create a dedicated social media group to document their journey, share news, and connect with allies beyond their neighborhood. They began crafting posts that highlighted their initiatives, events, and the injustices they faced. Each post was a testament to their determination to create a safer and more equitable community. As their online presence grew, they garnered the attention of local news outlets. Journalists began covering their events, amplifying their message and bringing their struggles to a broader audience. This newfound visibility attracted support from surrounding communities, and soon, neighboring towns joined the movement, sharing their own experiences with racism and police misconduct. One evening, during a community meeting, Mrs. Johnson received exciting news. A local news station wanted to feature their story in a special segment about grassroots movements for change. The residents erupted in cheers, realizing that their hard work was paying off. On the day of the interview, the excitement in the air was palpable. The camera crew arrived, and the community members eagerly gathered in the park, ready to share their stories. Mrs. Johnson stood at the forefront, proud of what they had accomplished together. As the reporter introduced the segment, the residents spoke passionately about their experiences and the importance of standing against racism. They shared how Officer Stone's actions had galvanized them to fight for their rights and create a safer community for all. "We are not just victims, we are warriors for justice," Mrs. Johnson declared on camera, her voice steady and powerful. "Together, we will ensure that our voices are heard and that change happens." The segment aired that evening, and as families gathered around their television sets, they watched in awe. Their stories were broadcast to a wider audience, and the community felt a sense of pride in their resilience and determination. As the days passed, the response was overwhelming. People from across the region reached out, offering support and solidarity. They organized joint events and shared resources, reinforcing the idea that this was not just a local issue, but a shared struggle that transcended borders. However, not everyone was pleased with the community's rise. Officer Stone, angered by the attention the residents were receiving, began to retaliate. He attempted to undermine their efforts by launching a smear campaign against Mrs. Johnson and the community leaders, painting them as troublemakers who were inciting unrest. He spread rumors about their workshops, claiming they were breeding grounds for violence and rebellion. Many in the community felt the weight of his intimidation tactics, but Mrs. Johnson reminded them of their strength. "We cannot let fear silence us. We stand together, united against hate and injustice," she encouraged. The community organized a rally to confront Officer Stone's lies. They invited the media to cover the event, determined to show their strength and resilience in the face of adversity. As the day approached, excitement and anxiety filled the air. On the day of the rally, hundreds gathered at the park, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Together we rise." The atmosphere was electric, with people chanting slogans and expressing their commitment to change. Mrs. Johnson stood at the front, her heart swelling with pride, as she surveyed the crowd. The rally began with speeches from community leaders, activists, and residents who shared their stories. They emphasized the importance of standing together, standing up for their rights, and rejecting the divisive tactics of those who sought to silence them. When it was Mrs. Johnson's turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone, her voice unwavering. "Today, we show that we will not be intimidated. We are a community that stands for justice, equality, and respect. We will not let anyone take that away from us." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the park. In that moment, Mrs. Johnson knew that they were more than just a community. They were a movement, a force for change that could not be stopped. As the rally concluded, the sense of unity and determination hung in the air. The community had taken a stand against Officer Stone's tactics, and their collective strength had only grown. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with knowledge, solidarity, and an unwavering belief in justice. The rally had been a tremendous success, and its impact resonated throughout the community. News of the event spread like wildfire, garnering attention not just locally, but also nationally. People reached out from far and wide, offering support, resources, and ideas to help the community in its fight against racial injustice. In the aftermath, Mrs. Johnson and her neighbors felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that this was just the beginning. They had sparked a movement that needed to keep growing. Inspired by the energy from the rally, they planned their next steps carefully. Mrs. Johnson decided it was time to form a coalition. This group would include not only their community members, but also allies from other neighborhoods and organizations dedicated to fighting racial injustice. She believed that a united front would amplify their message and increase their chances of making a lasting impact. In the days that followed, she and Malik worked tirelessly to identify potential coalition members. They reached out to local activists, civil rights organizations, and even college students who had shown interest in social justice. Their phone calls and emails were met with enthusiasm, and soon they had a list of individuals eager to join their cause. One evening, Mrs. Johnson hosted a meeting in her home. The room was filled with people from various backgrounds, all united by the same goal: to end racism and support their community. As they gathered around her dining table, Mrs. Johnson welcomed everyone warmly. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Together, we can build a coalition that stands for justice, equality, and respect for all," she began, her eyes shining with determination. "Our mission is clear: to educate our community, advocate for policy change, and hold those in power accountable." The group brainstormed ideas for their coalition's name. After much discussion, they decided on Unity for Justice. It reflected their commitment to coming together as one force, standing against oppression and advocating for change. As the weeks passed, Unity for Justice began to take shape. They organized regular meetings to discuss strategies, share updates, and plan upcoming events. The energy in the room was palpable. Everyone was passionate and driven to make a difference. One of their first initiatives was to launch an awareness campaign called Know Your Rights. They wanted to educate community members about their rights when interacting with law enforcement. The coalition created informational pamphlets and scheduled workshops where residents could learn about their legal rights and how to handle encounters with police. Malik volunteered to lead these workshops, knowing that many people in the community felt intimidated or powerless when dealing with officers like Stone. He wanted to empower them with knowledge and confidence. If we can educate our community, we can help them stand up for themselves, he explained during a coalition meeting. The first workshop took place at the local library, and the turnout exceeded their expectations. Residents filled the seats, eager to learn. Malik stood at the front, addressing the crowd with clarity and conviction. "Today, we're going to discuss your rights," he began, launching into the presentation. As he spoke, the audience listened intently. Malik shared practical tips on how to remain calm during a police encounter, what to say and what not to say, and how to document any interactions. He also emphasized the importance of knowing that they had the right to remain silent and to ask for legal representation. After the workshop, residents expressed their gratitude. "I never knew I had so many rights," one attendee remarked. "Thank you for teaching us how to stand up for ourselves." The feedback fueled Malik's determination to continue these workshops, and Unity for Justice planned several more sessions in the coming weeks. While the coalition worked diligently to empower the community, Officer Stone was not idle. As the coalition gained momentum, he became increasingly agitated. He saw the growing unity among the residents as a threat to his authority. In an attempt to intimidate them, Stone began showing up at their events, lurking in the background with a menacing presence. He would stand near the entrance, arms crossed, his expression stern. His intention was clear. He wanted to instill fear and disrupt the community's progress. But instead of deterring them, Stone's presence only fueled their resolve. Mrs. Johnson encouraged everyone to remain calm and focused. "We cannot let fear control us. We have the power to create change, and we will not be silenced," she urged. The coalition also decided to invite local officials and law enforcement representatives to their upcoming events. They wanted to foster dialogue and build bridges, but they were also prepared to hold them accountable for their actions. The residents knew that to create lasting change, they needed to engage with those in power. During one of their events, they invited the local police chief to speak. The community filled the room with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. As the chief took the stage, the atmosphere was charged. "Thank you for having me here today," he began, but the audience was hesitant. They had seen how Officer Stone treated them, and they wanted real change, not empty promises. Mrs. Johnson stood up, ready to speak. "We appreciate your presence, but we need to address the issue of racial profiling and the treatment of our community by officers like Stone," she said, her voice steady. The room fell silent, and the chief nodded. "I understand your concerns. We are committed to improving relations with the community, and I want to hear your suggestions." This moment marked a turning point for the coalition. They realized that by engaging with law enforcement and holding them accountable, they could begin to foster real change. Together, they crafted a list of recommendations to improve police-community relations, emphasizing the importance of training and transparency. As the weeks progressed, the coalition's efforts began to show results. More community members started attending the meetings, and local officials took notice of their growing influence. The coalition's advocacy reached the ears of local media, leading to more coverage of their initiatives. But the fight was far from over. Officer Stone continued his attempts to undermine their efforts, trying to sway public opinion against the coalition. However, Mrs. Johnson and her neighbors were determined. They would not back down. They would continue to stand strong and united in their quest for justice. Unity for Justice was gaining momentum, and as they prepared for their next big event, a community forum, everyone could feel that they were on the brink of something significant. The time for change was now, and they were ready to face the challenges ahead together. The day of the community forum arrived, and excitement mixed with nervous anticipation filled the air. Residents had been preparing for weeks, eager to share their experiences and discuss important issues regarding racial injustice and police accountability. The forum was set to be a platform for open dialogue, where community members could voice their concerns and propose solutions. Mrs. Johnson arrived early to help set up the venue. The community center was decorated with banners that read "Unity for Justice" and "Together We Rise." Rows of chairs were arranged in a circle to encourage interaction and dialogue. As she looked around, she felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. People began to trickle in, and the atmosphere buzzed with energy. Neighbors greeted one another warmly, sharing stories and expressing their hopes for the forum. Malik was busy at the entrance, handing out pamphlets that outlined the agenda for the evening. The excitement was palpable as more attendees arrived, filling the seats. When the forum officially began, Mrs. Johnson stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight. We are gathered to share our experiences, listen to one another, and work together towards solutions," she began, her voice filled with determination. "This is our opportunity to be heard." The audience applauded, and Mrs. Johnson introduced the panelists for the evening, which included local leaders, activists, and representatives from law enforcement. She hoped that having law enforcement present would encourage constructive dialogue, but she was also aware of the skepticism in the room. As the discussion commenced, residents shared their stories. One woman spoke about her son's encounter with Officer Stone, detailing how he had been unfairly targeted and treated with aggression. "We want to feel safe in our own community, not live in fear of the very people sworn to protect us," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. As the stories unfolded, the panelists listened attentively, their expressions serious. The room was filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. Mrs. Johnson took note of the palpable frustration among the residents and knew that they had to address the issue head-on. "Many of you have experienced racial profiling and unfair treatment," Mrs. Johnson said, her tone resolute. "We cannot let these experiences be brushed aside. We need accountability from our police force." The audience erupted in applause, echoing their agreement. The police chief took the stage, acknowledging the community's concerns. "I appreciate you sharing your stories. We are committed to improving our relationship with the community," he said. However, some residents remained skeptical, expressing doubts about the sincerity of the police department's commitment to change. Malik raised his hand, eager to contribute. "If you want to build trust, you need to be transparent. We need to know that complaints are taken seriously and that officers are held accountable for their actions," he said, his voice steady. The room echoed with murmurs of agreement. The chief nodded, acknowledging Malik's points. "We are currently working on implementing new training programs to address these issues," he stated. "We want to hear from you about what needs to change." This was a step forward, but many residents wanted to see concrete actions rather than just promises. As the forum continued, Mrs. Johnson facilitated a brainstorming session, encouraging attendees to come up with actionable solutions. She divided the participants into small groups, assigning each group a specific topic, such as community police relations, youth engagement, and safety initiatives. After some time, each group shared their ideas with the larger assembly. Suggestions ranged from establishing a community review board to monitor police conduct, to creating youth mentorship programs that foster positive relationships between young people and law enforcement. As the discussions progressed, the atmosphere began to shift. Residents felt empowered by their voices being heard, and the panelists took notes, genuinely considering the ideas presented. However, as the night went on, a familiar tension filled the room when Officer Stone entered. He positioned himself at the back, arms crossed, his presence immediately shifting the mood. Many attendees shot him wary glances, remembering the pain and fear he had caused. Mrs. Johnson noticed the change and decided to address it directly. "We need to engage in honest conversations," she stated firmly, looking toward Stone. "You represent the past that we want to change. We cannot ignore that history." The audience murmured in agreement, feeling the weight of her words. Stone shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Johnson pressed on. "We're here to work towards a better future, but it requires trust and accountability from everyone involved, including you." After a brief silence, Stone finally spoke. "I understand your concerns. I'm here to listen and learn." His tone was defensive, but the community sensed an opportunity for dialogue. As the forum neared its conclusion, the energy in the room shifted. People felt heard, and the discussions had sparked hope for future collaboration. Mrs. Johnson encouraged attendees to stay engaged and continue to push for change. "Our voices matter. We need to keep this conversation going, not just tonight, but every day," she declared. The evening ended on a positive note, with attendees exchanging contact information and discussing future meetings. Mrs. Johnson felt a renewed sense of purpose as she watched her neighbors come together, united in their fight for justice. After the forum, Malik approached Mrs. Johnson with a big smile. "We did it. People were really engaged, and I think we made a difference tonight," he said, his enthusiasm infectious. Mrs. Johnson nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, we did. But this is just the beginning. We need to keep pushing for accountability and ensure that our voices are always heard," she replied. As they packed up the leftover materials, Mrs. Johnson knew that their efforts were paving the way for a brighter future. Together, they were building a movement that could bring real change to their community, one conversation at a time. With every forum, workshop, and meeting, they were laying the groundwork for a safer and more equitable world for everyone. The journey ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it together. As the weeks passed, momentum for change in the community continued to build. The forum had ignited a fire within the residents, inspiring them to organize a rally for justice. Mrs. Johnson and Malik, along with a group of dedicated volunteers, worked tirelessly to plan the event. Their goal was to raise awareness about racial injustice and demand accountability from local law enforcement. The rally was set for a Saturday afternoon at the park, a central location where people could gather and share their voices. Posters were made, flyers were distributed, and social media was abuzz with news of the upcoming event. Residents from all walks of life were encouraged to attend, and the excitement in the air was palpable. On the day of the rally, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the park. As people began to arrive, a sense of unity filled the atmosphere. Friends greeted one another, families gathered with children, and local leaders came to lend their support. Mrs. Johnson stood at the forefront, her heart racing with anticipation. "Today is our chance to make a statement," she said to the crowd, her voice amplified by a portable speaker. "We are here to demand justice and accountability. We are here to make our voices heard." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy infectious. As the rally commenced, speakers took turns at the microphone, sharing personal stories of injustice and discrimination. A young man spoke about his experiences with racial profiling, detailing how he had been stopped by Officer Stone multiple times for no reason. "I'm tired of being treated like a criminal just because of the color of my skin," he declared, his voice filled with passion. The audience responded with shouts of encouragement and solidarity. Malik took the stage next, and he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. "We are here today because we believe in a better future," he began. "A future where we can walk our streets without fear, where we can trust our police to protect us, not harm us." His words resonated deeply with the crowd, and they rallied behind him, chanting, "No justice, no peace." As the speakers continued, the crowd grew larger, drawing in curious onlookers and supporters from neighboring communities. Mrs. Johnson watched with pride as families joined hands, friends embraced, and people of all ages stood together in solidarity. The rally was becoming a powerful movement for change. Towards the end of the event, Mrs. Johnson called for everyone to join her in a moment of silence. "Let's take a moment to remember those we have lost to violence and injustice," she said, her voice soft yet firm. The crowd fell silent, each person reflecting on the gravity of the situation. It was a poignant reminder of why they were fighting so hard. Once the moment of silence ended, a local musician stepped forward to perform a song about hope and unity. The melody floated through the air, lifting spirits and reminding everyone of their shared humanity. As the music played, people began to dance, their laughter and joy contrasting with the serious nature of the rally. Just as the event began to wind down, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. Officer Stone. The crowd noticed him immediately, and a wave of tension surged through the gathering. Whispers filled the air, and some attendees glared at him, unsure of his intentions. Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, knowing that this was a critical moment. She stepped forward, determined to address the situation. "We are here to talk, not to fight," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We want to create a dialogue, but it requires trust on both sides." Officer Stone raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to listen," he replied, though his tone was guarded. "I want to understand what the community needs and how I can help." The crowd hesitated, some still skeptical, but others nodded in agreement. Mrs. Johnson decided to seize the opportunity. "If you truly want to listen, then let's have that conversation. What steps can you take to rebuild trust with the community?" Stone looked around, sensing the tension. "I can commit to attending community meetings and being more visible in the neighborhood," he offered. "I want to work with you all to create a safer environment." As the crowd considered his words, Malik spoke up. "That's a start, but we need more than just promises. We need accountability measures in place. We need to know that if an officer does something wrong, there will be consequences." "Absolutely." Stone nodded. "I agree. I want to help make those changes happen. I need your feedback to understand how to do this effectively." The atmosphere began to shift as the crowd realized that Stone was sincere in his desire to engage. People started to speak up, sharing their ideas and concerns with him directly. It was a pivotal moment, bridging the gap between the community and law enforcement. As the rally came to a close, Mrs. Johnson looked around at the crowd, feeling a wave of hope wash over her. "Today, we have taken a significant step towards change," she proclaimed. "Let's continue this dialogue and hold each other accountable as we move forward together." The crowd cheered, and as people began to disperse, many lingered to continue conversations with Officer Stone and one another. The atmosphere was no longer one of fear and distrust. Instead, it was filled with a sense of possibility and hope. Walking home, Malik and Mrs. Johnson reflected on the day's events. "I can't believe we made it this far," Malik said, grinning from ear to ear. "It feels like we're really starting to make a difference." Mrs. Johnson nodded, her heart full. "This is just the beginning. Together, we can change the narrative and create a community where everyone feels safe and respected." They walked side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their quest for justice and equality. In the weeks following the rally, the atmosphere in the community began to shift. People were more engaged, and conversations about racial justice and police accountability continued to flourish. The initial skepticism towards Officer Stone slowly transformed into cautious optimism as he made an effort to connect with residents. He attended community meetings and even participated in local events, trying to show he was serious about change. Mrs. Johnson noticed the difference in her neighborhood. Residents who had once felt isolated were now coming together to discuss their experiences and explore ways to create a safer environment for everyone. Inspired by the rally's success, they formed a community action group to address various issues, including policing practices, youth mentorship programs, and neighborhood safety initiatives. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Johnson organized a potluck at the community center to foster relationships between residents and local law enforcement. She wanted to create a space where everyone could come together, share a meal, and build trust. The aroma of home-cooked dishes filled the room as people brought their favorite recipes to share. The community center buzzed with laughter and chatter as neighbors set up tables and decorated the space with colorful tablecloths and flowers. As people arrived, they greeted one another warmly, some excitedly discussing the latest developments in their community initiatives. Officer Stone was also there, mingling with residents, attempting to break down the barriers that had once separated him from the community. "Thanks for inviting me, Mrs. Johnson," he said, looking genuinely appreciative. "I really want to get to know everyone better." "I'm glad you're here, Officer Stone," she replied, smiling. "This is a chance for everyone to connect outside of formal settings. We're all neighbors, after all." As the potluck began, residents gathered around the tables to enjoy a variety of dishes. There were fragrant curries, hearty casseroles, fresh salads, and delicious desserts. People shared their culinary creations and the stories behind them, laughing and enjoying each other's company. During the meal, Mrs. Johnson encouraged attendees to share their thoughts about how to improve their community. "Let's discuss what we can do moving forward. What are your ideas?" she asked, her voice carrying over the chatter. One young mother spoke up. "I think we should start a youth program that encourages kids to learn about community service and leadership. It can help bridge the gap between the police and our youth." The audience nodded in agreement, excited by the idea. Another resident added, "We should hold regular workshops where we can discuss our experiences and concerns with the police. It could help build trust and understanding." Officer Stone listened intently, jotting down notes. "I'd like to help organize those workshops," he said. "I believe it's important for officers to hear directly from you about your experiences." As the evening went on, the atmosphere became more relaxed, with people sharing laughter and stories. An unexpected friendship began to blossom between Officer Stone and a few local youths who joked and laughed with him, breaking down the stereotypes that had long existed. After dinner, Mrs. Johnson invited everyone to gather in a circle for open discussion. She encouraged people to voice any lingering concerns and share their hopes for the future. The room filled with nervous energy, but the residents knew they were in a safe space. A teenager named Jamal stood up. "I want to feel safe when I see a police officer, but sometimes I'm scared because of how I've been treated before," he said, his voice shaky yet confident. "I hope we can change that." His words struck a chord, and several people nodded in agreement. "We're all human, and we need to learn from each other," Mrs. Johnson responded, her voice steady. "This is a journey, and it will take time, but we're taking steps in the right direction." The discussion continued, with residents sharing their experiences, hopes, and fears. Officer Stone asked questions, trying to understand better how he could contribute to the community's healing process. For many, it was the first time they felt heard and validated by a member of law enforcement. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of fulfillment. They had created an environment where open dialogue was possible, and barriers were slowly crumbling. The connections formed that night were invaluable, and she knew it was just the beginning of a long but essential journey. After everyone had left, Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone lingered for a moment, discussing the evening. "Thank you for organizing this, Mrs. Johnson," he said, his tone sincere. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm committed to making things better." "We all are," she replied, smiling. "It's about building trust and working together. I appreciate you being here and engaging with the community. That means a lot." As they finished cleaning up the space, Mrs. Johnson felt a renewed sense of hope. This potluck had been more than just a meal. It had been a catalyst for change. The community was coming together, forging bonds that would carry them through the challenges ahead. In the weeks that followed, the Community Action Group continued to meet regularly, and plans for the youth mentorship program and workshops began to take shape. Officer Stone remained actively involved, becoming a visible part of the community he served. Together, they were forging a new path, one that emphasized understanding, respect, and accountability. The seeds of change had been planted, and with dedication and effort, they were beginning to grow. Mrs. Johnson looked forward to what the future held, knowing that they were all in this together, working towards a brighter, more just community. As the community continued to evolve, Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone finalized the plans for the first workshop aimed at building trust between residents and law enforcement. The workshop was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the community center, where people could gather to discuss their concerns and experiences with police interactions. In the days leading up to the event, excitement and nervousness filled the air. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, encouraging everyone to attend and share their thoughts. Mrs. Johnson emphasized the importance of participation, reminding people that this was an opportunity to create a dialogue that could lead to real change. On the day of the workshop, the community center buzzed with energy. Families arrived, chatting and greeting one another as they filled the room. The scent of fresh coffee wafted through the air, and Mrs. Johnson set up tables in a large circle to promote openness and engagement. When Officer Stone arrived, he was greeted with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He understood the importance of being transparent and honest in these discussions. He made his way around the room, introducing himself to everyone and inviting them to share their stories and concerns. As the workshop began, Mrs. Johnson welcomed everyone and expressed her gratitude for their attendance. This is a safe space for all of us to speak openly about our experiences and feelings. Our goal today is to listen and learn from one another, she said, her voice filled with warmth. Officer Stone took a deep breath and spoke up. I want to thank you all for being here. I know there's a lot of distrust, and I'm here to listen and understand how I can do better as a police officer in this community. I'm committed to making a difference. The crowd remained quiet, still uncertain about how to proceed. To ease the tension, Mrs. Johnson suggested starting with a round of introductions, where everyone could share their names and something they loved about their community. As each person spoke, the atmosphere began to shift from apprehension to connection. Laughter filled the room as people shared stories about their favorite parks, local businesses, and community events. Once everyone had introduced themselves, Mrs. Johnson posed the first question. What are your thoughts on policing in our community? What experiences have shaped your views? A young woman named Aisha spoke up first. I've had some bad experiences with police in the past. I remember feeling scared and helpless when I was pulled over for no reason. It felt like I was being targeted because of my race. Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. I want to trust the police, but I need to know that I'm not going to be judged or mistreated. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed her words. Officer Stone nodded, acknowledging her feelings. I'm really sorry to hear that you felt that way. I want you to know that not every officer thinks or acts the same. We need to do better, and I appreciate you sharing your experience. Another resident, an older man named Mr. Thompson, chimed in. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. I've seen things get worse, and I don't feel as safe as I used to. Sometimes it feels like we're more of a target than a community to protect. Mrs. Johnson looked around the room, noting the expressions of agreement on many faces. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Thompson. It's important for us to acknowledge these feelings. Officer Stone, what steps can be taken to address these concerns? Officer Stone responded thoughtfully. We need to improve our training to ensure that officers understand the communities they serve. It's not just about enforcing laws. It's about building relationships. I also believe in community policing, where officers engage with residents outside of emergencies. The discussion continued, with residents sharing personal stories and ideas for improving communication and collaboration with law enforcement. Officer Stone actively listened, asking clarifying questions and taking notes on the suggestions presented. As the workshop progressed, the atmosphere began to feel more collaborative. People started to share positive experiences as well. A man named Carlos talked about how he once saw Officer Stone helping children learn how to ride their bikes safely. I appreciated that, he said. It showed me that not all interactions have to be negative. The conversation flowed naturally, allowing everyone to express their thoughts and feelings. Mrs. Johnson facilitated the discussion, ensuring that each voice was heard. She encouraged participants to think of actionable steps they could take together as a community. As the workshop neared its end, Officer Stone addressed the group. "I want to thank each of you for being open and honest today. I know trust takes time, and I'm committed to earning it back. Together, we can work towards a safer community for everyone." Mrs. Johnson concluded the workshop by summarizing the main points discussed and encouraging everyone to stay engaged. "Let's continue to support each other and hold each other accountable. This is just the beginning of our journey." As attendees began to leave, many approached Officer Stone to shake his hand or share a few final words. The workshop had started a vital conversation that would help shape the future of their community. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the community center, Mrs. Johnson felt a surge of hope. The workshop had been a success, and the connections formed that day laid the groundwork for a more united community. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were taking meaningful steps forward. Together, they were building a brighter future, one conversation at a time. Following the successful workshop, the community buzzed with newfound energy and purpose. Residents were eager to implement the ideas discussed, and plans for a youth mentorship program and further workshops began to take shape. Mrs. Johnson took the lead in organizing these initiatives, rallying volunteers to help with the logistics. Officer Stone remained deeply involved in the planning process. He understood the importance of accountability, and he was determined to show the community that he meant what he had said. Together, they aimed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, starting with the youth. The Youth Mentorship Program was designed to connect young people with positive role models in the community, including police officers. The program would focus on leadership skills, community service, and open dialogue about challenges faced by both youth and law enforcement. Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone envisioned it as a way to foster understanding and respect between the two groups. As they prepared for the first mentorship meeting, excitement filled the air. Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone set up the community center with chairs in a large circle, ensuring that everyone could see and hear one another. They decorated the room with colorful posters showcasing the program's goals and the importance of community involvement. On the day of the first meeting, young people from the neighborhood arrived, some accompanied by their parents. The atmosphere was a mix of curiosity and apprehension. As the youth entered the room, they saw familiar faces of their peers and adults who had been actively involved in the community. Mrs. Johnson greeted each participant warmly, helping to ease any nervousness. "Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today. This program is all about you and how we can support each other," Mrs. Johnson began. She encouraged the youth to share their thoughts and expectations for the program. "What do you hope to gain from being part of this mentorship initiative?" A girl named Mia spoke up. "I want to learn how to speak up about what's going on in our neighborhood. Sometimes it feels like nobody listens to us." Her honesty resonated with others. Several young people nodded in agreement, sharing their desire for their voices to be heard. Officer Stone stood up and introduced himself, hoping to break the ice. "I'm Officer Stone, and I'm here because I believe in you and your potential. I want to hear your ideas and experiences. We're not here to lecture you. We're here to listen and learn from each other." The group dynamic shifted, with young people feeling more comfortable sharing their thoughts. They began to discuss the issues they faced in their community, from concerns about safety to the desire for more recreational activities. "Sometimes we just need someone to talk to," said a boy named Marcus. "It's hard for us to understand police officers when we only see them in uniform. It feels like they don't really care about us." Officer Stone nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, and I want to change that perception. This program is a way for us to get to know each other better. We need to build trust, and that starts with open conversations." The meeting progressed with engaging discussions. The youth shared their ideas for community projects, including cleanup days, sports events, and awareness campaigns. Officer Stone encouraged their creativity and offered to help connect them with resources to make their ideas a reality. As the meeting came to a close, Mrs. Johnson suggested they end with a fun team-building activity. The group played a game where they had to work together to solve a challenge. promoting cooperation and communication. Laughter filled the room as the young people bonded over shared experiences, and even Officer Stone joined in, showing his playful side. After the meeting, several youth approached Officer Stone, eager to talk. They shared their dreams and aspirations, discussing their challenges and the changes they hoped to see in their community. "Can we organize a basketball tournament?" asked Marcus, his eyes lighting up. "It would be fun, and we could invite the police to join." "I love that idea," Officer Stone replied, excited. "Let's make it happen. We can work together to bring everyone out for a day of fun and competition. It's a great way to build connections." As the first mentorship meeting concluded, Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of accomplishment. She had witnessed the power of open dialogue and collaboration, and she knew that this program could be a turning point for the community. It was more than just an initiative. It was a movement toward understanding and unity. In the following weeks, the youth mentorship program flourished. The basketball tournament was scheduled, and plans for more workshops were set in motion. With each meeting, the bond between Officer Stone and the youth strengthened. They were learning to see each other as allies, not adversaries. As the community continued to evolve, Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone reflected on how far they had come. Trust was being built through action, and the impact of their efforts was beginning to show. But Mrs. Johnson knew that the journey was just beginning. They had taken significant steps toward reconciliation, yet there was still much work to be done. The conversations, initiatives, and friendships formed through the mentorship program would pave the way for a brighter, more unified future for everyone in the community. Together, they were fostering a new narrative, one of hope, understanding, and collaboration. The day of the basketball tournament arrived, and the community center buzzed with excitement. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the smell of hot dogs and popcorn filled the air. Families arrived early, bringing blankets and chairs to set up along the sidelines. Children laughed and ran around, their energy contagious as they anticipated a day filled with fun and competition. Mrs. Johnson had worked tirelessly to organize the event, and she could feel the excitement radiating from the crowd. She welcomed everyone as they arrived, encouraging parents to join in the festivities. Officer Stone was also present, wearing his basketball jersey, ready to connect with the youth in a relaxed environment. The tournament was designed to not only showcase basketball skills, but also to promote teamwork and community spirit. Teams of young people had been formed based on age and skill level, with each team receiving matching t-shirts. The names of the teams were playful and spirited: Hoops for Hope, the Dream Team, and Unity Warriors. As the first game began, the atmosphere was electric. Parents and friends cheered from the sidelines, clapping and shouting encouragement. The sound of sneakers squeaking on the court and the bounce of the basketball created a rhythm that pulsed through the air. Officer Stone took a moment to observe the players. He could see how much the tournament meant to them. It wasn't just about the game. It was about bringing the community together and breaking down barriers. He remembered the initial workshop where trust was fragile, and now, here they were, laughing and playing together. In between games, Officer Stone interacted with the crowd. He joined a group of kids playing frisbee, showing them some tricks while sharing stories about his own childhood. He made sure to connect with parents too, answering questions about community policing and expressing his commitment to making a positive impact. As the day progressed, the games became more intense. Each team played with heart and determination, displaying impressive skills and teamwork. The crowd erupted in cheers as players made impressive shots and executed clever plays. Even the younger siblings, who were too small to play, cheered enthusiastically, mimicking their older siblings. During a break, Mrs. Johnson gathered everyone around to highlight the importance of sportsmanship. Today is not just about winning. It's about coming together as a community. Let's remember to support each other, no matter the outcome, she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. As the final game approached, tensions ran high. The championship match was set between Hoops for Hope and the Dream Team. The two teams had battled fiercely throughout the tournament, and the excitement in the air was palpable. Before the game began, Mrs. Johnson asked everyone to gather for a group photo. "Let's capture this moment of unity and celebration," she said. The teams, along with Officer Stone and other community members, gathered together, smiling widely for the camera. This image would serve as a reminder of their collective efforts toward building trust and connection. With the photo taken, the championship game started. The crowd cheered wildly, encouraging their favorite players. The game was neck and neck, with both teams displaying incredible skills and teamwork. Every basket made was met with thunderous applause, and the spirit of friendly competition filled the air. As the game reached its final minutes, the score was tied. Tension mounted as players pushed themselves to the limit. In the last few seconds, Marcus from the Dream Team made a daring shot from beyond the arc. The ball sailed through the air and swished through the net just as the buzzer sounded. The crowd erupted in cheers, celebrating the victory. After the game, both teams shook hands, exemplifying sportsmanship and respect. Officer Stone stepped forward, congratulating both teams for their effort and spirit. "Today, you've all shown what it means to be part of a community. Let's carry this spirit forward in everything we do," he said, beaming with pride. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the community center, families gathered for a barbecue. Laughter and chatter filled the air as people enjoyed food together, sharing stories and building relationships. Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The tournament had been a success, not just in terms of the games played, but in the connections forged among neighbors. As people mingled, Mrs. Johnson spotted Aisha and Mia talking animatedly with Officer Stone. They were discussing ideas for their next community project, brainstorming ways to keep the momentum going. This was precisely what she had hoped for, a community coming together, creating a better future for themselves and their children. Later that evening, as the last guests began to leave, Mrs. Johnson stood outside the community center, watching families walk home together. The day had been filled with joy and connection, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The basketball tournament was more than just a fun event. It was a testament to the power of unity and understanding. The seeds of trust planted through their efforts were starting to take root, and Mrs. Johnson knew that this was only the beginning. As she locked up the community center, she looked forward to what the future held. With Officer Stone and the residents working together, they could continue to bridge gaps and create a neighborhood where everyone felt safe and valued. The journey to healing and trust was ongoing, but together, they were making strides toward a brighter tomorrow. The weeks following the basketball tournament were a whirlwind of activity. The sense of unity and purpose that had emerged during the event fueled a series of community initiatives, each one aimed at building on the momentum they had created together. Mrs. Johnson, along with Officer Stone, worked tirelessly to ensure that the community remained engaged and involved. The youth mentorship program quickly gained popularity, with more young people wanting to join. Officer Stone and Mrs. Johnson organized regular meetings where youth could not only engage in discussions, but also participate in fun activities, workshops, and skill-building sessions. They invited local leaders and professionals to share their experiences, fostering inspiration and motivation among the young participants. In addition to the mentorship program, the community center became a hub for various projects. Residents collaborated to establish a community garden where families could come together to grow vegetables and flowers. It was a fantastic way to promote teamwork, sustainability, and healthy eating, while also beautifying the neighborhood. The garden was a physical representation of their hard work and dedication to each other. One Saturday, the garden project kicked off with a planting day. Families arrived with shovels, gloves, and bags of soil. The laughter of children echoed as they dug in the dirt, planting seeds together. Officer Stone joined in, helping the kids learn how to plant properly. "You see, planting a garden is just like building our community," he explained. "It takes time, care, and teamwork to make it flourish." As the community garden took shape, Residents also decided to organize a weekly farmers market. This market would not only provide fresh produce from their garden, but also showcase local artisans, bakers, and craftspeople. It was a way to celebrate local talent while fostering a sense of community pride. During the market's inaugural weekend, the atmosphere was lively. Residents set up booths filled with fresh vegetables, homemade jams, and handcrafted goods. Children played games while parents chatted and enjoyed the warm sunshine. Mrs. Johnson walked around, greeting everyone with a smile, feeling a deep sense of belonging and connection. The market quickly became a highlight of the week for many residents. It provided a space for people to come together, support local businesses, and share in the fruits of their labor, literally and figuratively. Officer Stone often volunteered at the market, using the opportunity to connect with families and answer any questions they had about law enforcement in their community. As the months passed, the impact of these initiatives was evident. Crime rates began to decrease, and the community felt safer. People were no longer fearful of law enforcement. Instead, they saw officers as partners in their well-being. The relationship had shifted from one of suspicion to one of collaboration and trust. One day, as Mrs. Johnson prepared for a community meeting, she received an unexpected call from the mayor's office. The mayor wanted to visit their community to see the positive changes firsthand. Excitement buzzed through Mrs. Johnson's veins as she relayed the news to Officer Stone. "This is a great opportunity to showcase everything we've accomplished," she said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. On the day of the mayor's visit, the community center was filled with decorations, and volunteers worked diligently to set up for a presentation. Residents gathered, eager to share their experiences and achievements with the mayor. When the mayor arrived, he was warmly welcomed by a crowd of smiling faces. Mrs. Johnson began the presentation, highlighting the successful mentorship program, the community garden, and the farmers market. She spoke passionately about the collaboration between law enforcement and the community, emphasizing the transformation they had achieved together. Officer Stone followed, sharing his personal journey and how the initiatives had changed not just the community, but also his perspective as a police officer. "Working alongside all of you has opened my eyes to the strength and resilience within this community," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Together, we can make a difference, and we have." The mayor listened intently, nodding as he took in the stories of unity and resilience. After the presentation, he commended the community for their hard work and dedication. "What I see here is a shining example of how communities can come together to create positive change," he said. "I want to support your efforts and ensure that other neighborhoods can learn from your success." As the event concluded, the mayor promised to allocate funds for future community initiatives, ensuring that their hard work would continue to flourish. The residents erupted in applause, their spirits soaring with the possibilities ahead. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone stood outside the community center, watching families leave with smiles on their faces. They reflected on how far they had come since the early days of mistrust and division. "This is just the beginning," Officer Stone said, looking at Mrs. Johnson. "The more we work together, the stronger we become." Mrs. Johnson nodded in agreement, her heart swelling with pride for their community. "We've created a model for what can happen when people unite for a common purpose. I can't wait to see where we go from here." As the stars twinkled overhead, a sense of hope filled the air. The community had transformed into a place where people supported one another, understood one another, and worked together toward a brighter future. With the seeds of trust firmly planted, they were ready to continue their journey, hand in hand, building a legacy of unity and strength for generations to come. Months rolled by, and the community's efforts continued to bear fruit. The mentorship program had grown into a staple of the neighborhood, with older youths stepping up to become mentors themselves. The young people thrived under this new structure, gaining confidence and skills that would serve them well beyond the community's borders. They participated in leadership workshops and learned about financial literacy, health education, and conflict resolution. The program became a beacon of hope, drawing interest from neighboring communities looking to replicate their success. Officer Stone felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he watched the transformation unfold. He attended the mentorship sessions regularly, engaging with the youths and listening to their ideas. He encouraged them to express their thoughts and concerns, fostering an open dialogue that strengthened the bonds between them. The teens were excited to learn, and their enthusiasm motivated him to invest even more in their development. Meanwhile, the community garden flourished, becoming a vibrant oasis filled with colorful fruits and vegetables. Families gathered there not only to tend to their plants, but also to enjoy picnics and community gatherings. They shared recipes, cooked meals, and organized garden days where everyone pitched in to maintain their little paradise. The garden became a symbol of their collective hard work and dedication, nurturing both plants and relationships. The weekly farmers' market continued to thrive, drawing larger crowds each week. Local artisans showcased their crafts, and families found joy in supporting one another. As the market expanded, Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone decided to include cultural events, inviting musicians, dancers, and storytellers to perform. This initiative enriched the community's cultural tapestry and encouraged residents to share their diverse heritages. One particularly warm Saturday, a local band performed at the market. The atmosphere was lively, with people dancing and clapping along to the music. Children ran around, their laughter echoing through the air. As Mrs. Johnson watched the scene unfold, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This was the dream she had envisioned, a thriving community, united and joyful. As the seasons changed, the community planned a major event, the first annual Unity Festival. It would celebrate their achievements, bringing together all residents for a day of fun, food, and festivities. The planning committee consisted of a diverse group of residents, and everyone eagerly contributed their ideas. They arranged games, food stalls, workshops, and performances, ensuring that there would be something for everyone. On the day of the Unity Festival, the community center was transformed into a colorful celebration. Banners decorated the walls, and laughter filled the air as families arrived, excited for the day ahead. Officer Stone took on the role of MC, greeting attendees and introducing various activities. He felt a sense of pride, seeing people from all walks of life coming together in harmony. The festival featured a talent show where local residents showcased their skills. From singers and dancers to poets and artists, each performance was met with loud cheers and applause. The festival not only highlighted individual talents, but also emphasized the rich diversity within the community. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the festival, Mrs. Johnson stepped onto the stage. She took a moment to look out at the crowd, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. Today, we celebrate our unity, our diversity, and our strength as a community, she said, her voice steady and warm. What we've built here is not just a series of programs or events. It's a legacy of trust and connection. Together, we have shown what it means to support one another. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the air. Many nodded, tears glistening in their eyes, as they reflected on how far they had come together. Mrs. Johnson continued, "Let us carry this spirit forward, ensuring that our community remains a safe haven for everyone. Let us teach the next generation the values we hold dear: respect, love, and understanding." After her speech, Officer Stone stepped up to the microphone. "I am honored to be a part of this community," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've all opened my eyes to what it truly means to serve and protect. I commit to continuing this journey with you, ensuring that our relationship only grows stronger." The festival culminated in a spectacular fireworks display, lighting up the night sky in a breathtaking array of colors. Families gathered together, watching in awe as the fireworks painted the darkness with brilliance. In that moment, they were reminded that together, they could create something beautiful. As the event drew to a close, Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone stood side by side, watching the community celebrate. They shared a quiet moment of reflection, recognizing the powerful impact they had made together. The road had not always been easy, but the love and determination of the community had transformed challenges into opportunities for growth and healing. Weeks later, the community received recognition from the City Council for their outstanding efforts in fostering unity and cooperation. They were invited to share their story at a conference focused on community building, inspiring others to follow their example. Mrs. Johnson and Officer Stone presented together, recounting their journey, the ups and downs, and the triumphs they had achieved. As they shared their story with a captivated audience, it became clear that their legacy would extend far beyond their neighborhood. The lessons learned and the bonds formed would resonate with many, igniting a passion for community engagement in others. As time went on, the community continued to thrive. New families moved in, drawn by the stories they had heard of this extraordinary neighborhood. The culture of trust and cooperation remained strong, and the community's initiatives expanded even further, addressing various needs and interests. Years later, as Mrs. Johnson walked through the community garden with her grandchildren, she reflected on the journey they had undertaken. The garden was now filled with laughter and chatter, with young people learning from their elders just as they had envisioned. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" she said, smiling at her grandchildren as they helped pick fresh vegetables. "We've created something special here." "Yes, Grandma," they replied in unison, their faces lit up with joy. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Mrs. Johnson felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that the legacy of trust, understanding, and community spirit would continue to grow and flourish for generations to come. The journey had been incredible, and she felt grateful to have played a part in building a better future for all.